Hello. Our story begins on Mandalore with resolution, but also defeat. Obi Wan and Satine had spent the longer part of the last year out in shadows, surviving off their own wits. The Jedi Padawan and the Duchess were an unlikely duo, but they made a good one, despite their differences. Perhaps there was something more lying beneath the surface for the two of them, yet nothing prepared them for the news they would return to. Obi Wan and Satine were brought back to the new capital of Mandalore, Sundari, by 3 Jedi Masters. Among them were Counselor Master Windu, Pong Krell, and Ima Gundy. This trio had been dispatched from the Jedi Temple because of a distress call from Qui-Gon's frequency. He called the individual figure a Sith, but even at the sight of death, the Jedi were uncertain if a Sith could do it. Dooku would have and probably should have been here, but he wasn't. No one knew the truth about Qui-Gon's fate, but news was stretching around the temple and to Jedi far away from it, which is where Dooku was. He was doing work for a couple of people in need just north of Megiddo when he was informed. Going to Mandalore would be nearly impossible due to his circumstances. Obi-Wan, though, was devastated. He returned with sunshine in his eyes, excited to see Master Jinn after nearly a year of being totally apart. Mace Windu informed him privately, as the High Guard took the Duchess elsewhere, away from her friend. Obi-Wan, as a Jedi, withheld his tears, which was harder than he ever thought it would be. Since he had been alone for an entire year, feeling emotions, building an attachment, he was walloped with the reality of being a Jedi still. He wanted to know how Qui-Gon died, and Mace didn't know. The thing with Windu's report and his account of the situation was confusing. Master Jinn sent out a transmission in the middle of the night, reporting on Sith activity on the Mandalore system. He reported that he wanted to track it, which, in all fairness to him, he did plan to track her on the Sith Lord's vessel, but from there the trail went dead. The Jedi didn't even believe it to be a Sith. The vessel, nowhere to be seen. The battle that ensued was scrappy. It wasn't one with finesse or talents, but simply cheating one's way out of a battle. From the report of the death, Qui-Gon was cut across the abdomen and then shot in the head. Whoever killed him was likely the individual that possessed the Darksaber. Mace reported that the Jedi were not supposed to involve themselves any further, but it was time that the weapon returned to the Jedi Temple. Satine would later agree to the sentiment. Until then, Pong and Ima Gundy were heading out with the rest of the Mandalorian volunteers to find the weapon and whoever held it and bring them to justice. What the Jedi did not know was how short the duel between Qui-Gon and Darth Sidious were. The Dark Lord of the Sith, the apprentice of it, was on Mandalore for 2 purposes. He saw value in a warrior society instead of a political coalition created by Satine's father. His first mission was to turn Mandalore into a weak political system, so that the rise of the Confederacy wouldn't have any strong connections to remain peaceful. Sidious obviously didn't start the war, but he saw nothing wrong with tipping the scales to favor himself. The second reason Palpatine came here was because of Qui-Gon Jinn. Sidious and Dooku had already begun discussions. They weren't far along yet, but why not encourage Dooku to join him with the Jedi's death? Sidious needed a strong political ally, someone who could investigate the politics of the galaxy with ease and finesse. Killing Qui-Gon might incentivize Dooku to join the Sith earlier. Sidious didn't just murder Qui-Gon. They traded blows and he force-choked the Jedi Master, slashing him across the stomach, and then letting him writhe on the ground like an animal. Sidious revealed everything in those final moments. How Dooku would become a Sith, how the Jedi would fall, and how everything he loved about this universe would be flipped on its head. Sidious finished it with a fatal blow from a pistol, the perfect way to cover up his victory. As Palpatine expected, the Jedi assumed the Mandalorian insurgents were behind this. Even though the Jedi had their problems with attachment, they still allowed individuals to mourn. Mace gave Obi-Wan his space, and dispatched Krell and Ima to the Mandalorian moon of Concordia. Satine eventually found Obi-Wan and stood by him throughout this time. It was especially hard for him considering the fact that he had thought about leaving the Jedi Order for her. It wasn't something he would do without Satine's word, but he in a way regret ever having those thoughts. He started processing his grief with regret and indecision. Surely he could have done something else. Maybe if he was here instead of flirting with Satine, he would have made a difference. It spiraled down through him. After spending time with Satine, He needed to go for a walk, which he did, through the ruined streets of Sundari in the middle of the night. Debris littered the ground. He left a trail by picking up soot and ash with every step and smearing it across the streets. He felt defeated. He could hardly live with himself for having betrayed his master. Obi-Wan did not process his grief properly and tore himself apart for something so far out of his control. As he was walking the dead silent streets, he saw a shadow and ignited his lightsaber. A hooded man looked at him as Kenobi demanded that he show some identification. An elder but deeper voice crept from the man's mouth. He didn't have any. He wasn't from Mandalore. Kenobi wanted answers now. Sidious could kill another Jedi, but the darkness seeping through this individual was enough to make Palpatine's mind twist with opportunity. Obi-Wan wasn't someone Sidious would take an interest in, but why not have multiple outlets for taking down the Jedi Order? It's what his own master, Plagueis, would do. It's why Plagueis openly allowed Maul to be trained under Palpatine's tutelage. The Sith Lord told Obi-Wan that he was here on Mandalore because of the Darksaber. He was so devastated to learn of Master Jinn's passing, and so he came here to kill the Mandalorians and remove that wretched weapon from their hands. Obi-Wan wanted to know why, or even more, who he was and why did he care so much about Master Jinn. Palpatine told Obi-Wan that he could refer to him as Sidious, and he asked the 17-year-old Jedi to take a walk with him. Kenobi put his lightsaber away and did as Palpatine suggested. The words that got Obi-Wan to put his weapon away was Sidious asking about Obi-Wan's grief. Kenobi was so thrown off by the question, and Sidious immediately fulfilled a missing hole in Obi-Wan's chest. He acted in a way similar to Qui-Gon, asking questions he knew answers to. Why was Obi-Wan so upset? Did he know Qui-Gon personally? Of course he did. Oh, so it was his master that was killed. How terrible. Surely the Jedi should have sent more members to Mandalore, being that Obi-Wan's mission with the Duchess was so important. These little statements, things to make a devout Jedi like Obi-Wan question the authority of the High Council. He hadn't really been known for questioning anything the Jedi did, but now, these were genuine concerns. Maybe he should look at the Jedi for this, potentially even blame them for having refused to act the way they probably should have. Obi-Wan openly expressed his shame in being a Jedi at this moment. The war was so pointless, and they couldn't even stop the Mandalorians from killing themselves. Most of Kenobi's questionable lines of thought were just a reflection of his sadness and internal agony. He wanted something or someone to be mad at. All of that blame fell on himself, and Palpatine gave Obi-Wan an outlet, a trail to follow, which he did. It started simply with diagnosing the grief, looking at what Obi-Wan was experiencing and giving him a different outlet, a way to work that pain into his studies. Obi-Wan didn't ever consider the Sith being a part of Qui-Gon's death. Mace didn't really even cover that when telling Obi-Wan about the murder. The Sith would never use a blaster pistol. It was against their pride, which traditionally was true, but the Sith evolved so that they could maintain their secrecy. The two spoke for hours as Sidious helped Obi-Wan see the pathway to healing himself without the light. This was never framed in a way to convince Obi-Wan that the Sith were here or even involved. This was him giving a lesson in the Force to a confused Jedi, someone who could become a useful asset to the Sith if properly manipulated. The simple lessons were to use the darkness and allow it to surround him, push that pain out of his body in an act of power. He could transform his sadness into something productive. To Obi-Wan, that didn't sound like the worst thing possible, and he decided to follow Palpatine's command. In the end, Kenobi would receive a communication code to stay in contact with Sidious, in case he needed more lessons on this. But that left Kenobi with yet another confusing quandary. He might have adopted a new method to dealing with grief, but his trust in the Jedi was now left shaken. He might not know that the Sith had returned, but without Qui-Gon Jinn, his entire perspective on the Jedi Order had been changed. Perhaps some of the ideals that Qui-Gon neglected were factual. Maybe the Jedi were too politically active. Maybe they were spreading out too far. All he knew is that he was leaving Mandalore, saying goodbye to a master and someone he kind of fell in love with. Satine almost said the word. She nearly told him to stay with her, but she feared that she was being too selfish and inconsiderate with that line of thought. Obi-Wan spoke highly of the Jedi Order. she never heard the ranging thoughts he felt after his interaction with Sidious. So, he left. While he would receive a new master upon arrival to Coruscant, his focus would be elsewhere. Obi-Wan waited for weeks for Krell and Imogun D to return with information about the Death Watch and the saber that killed his master. As the Jedi were instructed, they killed off members of the insurgent group. The Darksaber was returned to the Jedi Temple, per agreement between the Jedi and the Duchess. Obi-Wan, though, felt incomplete, so he relied on what Palpatine instructed him. Obi-Wan's new instructor was far from Qui-Gon. The Jedi actually picked her because she was more like Obi-Wan, before Mandalore obviously. Kenobi and Jinn butted heads a lot. It was frustrating, but it worked for them. Obi-Wan loved the way that Qui-Gon challenged him. The new instructor, a Miralan Jedi, would be true to the code, as most of their kind were as Jedi. Like Katri, Venestra, and Luminara, this Jedi Master instructed Obi-Wan from the perspective of a Jedi nun. He, as a result, felt two very conflicting emotions. He could either continue the path of the Jedi and suffer with very little reward with his new instructor, or he could take the words spoken by Sidious and transform his pain into power. Every day, especially after the Darksaber returned to Coruscant, the latter of the two options seemed more appealing. But it was a much harder path, because his new instructor was present and Sidious was elsewhere. This forced Obi-Wan to rely exclusively on the singular conversation he had with Palpatine on Mandalore. But that was the gift of darkness. It was always just enough, not entirely fulfilling. For Obi-Wan, the dark side was very unnatural. It took a force of nature to break him away from his instincts, but losing Qui-Gon did that to him. Many times he thought about telling Satine how he really felt. Now the moment felt like it had passed, when in reality, there was still a chance that Satine might allow him to come back into her life. But similar to how Satine believed she'd be selfish to ask him to leave the Order, he believed it'd be selfish of him to throw himself into the middle of her reconstruction period. They were two people that should have picked each other, and now they silently suffered alone. Kenobi didn't have the chance to get into contact with Sidious for another couple of months. His new Miralan Jedi Master was helping him along the path, and she truthfully believed he to be ready for knighthood. Without Qui-Gon and he butting heads, Obi-Wan progressed, in a way. It wasn't the development that he was on trajectory with initially, but it was a result of Palpatine's words of encouragement, if you will. The Miralan Master trusted Obi-Wan because of what she was told by the High Council when she was assigned to him, so the entire situation resulted in a game of telephone having gone wrong. The Council assigned her because Obi-Wan was aligned with the Jedi Code, more so than Dooku or Qui-Gon. Dooku showed very little interest in Obi-Wan and infrequently returned to the temple as is. The Miralan assumed that this was the right path for Obi-Wan to be on, and because of his use of Palpatine's techniques over her own, she believed that he had broken free from the chains of misery. His sorrow seemed non-existent, and he grew in concentration and connection to the Force. Kenobi didn't believe himself to be ready for his trials, but he passed with flying colors anyways. He thanked his instructor for guiding him through the finish line, but he needed to speak to Palpatine one more time, and so he reached out to his older friend from Mandalore. The two of them got into contact within the first week, and Obi-Wan met with Sidious out on the faraway world of Mimban. It was an odd location, but it was secretive. Obi-Wan spoke extensively about the tactics and how they helped him mend his internal sorrow and progress to a point of fulfillment, but he wanted more. Kenobi desired more of what the Force could give him, and with a glimmer of evil in his eye, the hooded Palpatine provided more tactics. He had developed a plan in the months since meeting Obi-Wan. Dooku was pretty much already joining the Sith because of Qui-Gon's death on Mandalore. Sidious didn't need a savvy politician, he needed someone who could sabotage the Jedi from the inside out. That could be Obi-Wan. Plagueis even encouraged Palpatine's direction with Obi-Wan, and it resulted in turning Kenobi to the dark side for the next few years, letting the bubble blow up slowly inside the young Jedi's heart, and when it was about to burst, they would use it effectively. Sidious gave Obi-Wan instructions for continuing forward, how to develop his dark side powers, how to fuel his attachments into his daily life, and methods to transforming himself into an agent of power. The thing with these lessons is they were not solely about the Sith. They were about obtaining control over the Force itself, which aligned with Sith values. Obi Wan refused to lose someone else because he was incapable of protecting them. He had only been 18 for a few weeks and he wasn't stable enough to handle this sudden shock of loss. There were questions and answers exchanged. Obi Wan was curious about forming other attachments with others, and Sidious rejected it. He, quote-unquote, feared what Obi Wan might do with those connections. He needed to hone his skills before forcing a relationship into his life. Kenobi understood, and returned to Coruscant with new lessons for delving deeper into the dark side. For the next few years, Obi-Wan Kenobi would become an agent of evil. On solo missions, he'd exhibit the dark side in a multitude of ways. He'd cut down pirates without mercy, use force choke on unsuspecting thugs, and force his hand on anyone who tried to challenge him. The Jedi Council knew nothing of this. Obi-Wan simply grew in power, but remained calm and collected, on the outside at least. He had impatience selectively, and he acted the part of a humble Jedi Knight, who lost a master too soon. During this development, Dooku would become Tyrannus years earlier. This didn't turn him into becoming a political advocate for the Confederacy though. He just had deeper roots. The corporate alliances under Plagueis' instruction were united on Serenum. Discussions were held between the largest conglomerates in the galaxy, and the wealthy business owner, Hego Damas II, influenced these people into signing agreements and creating dynamics that wouldn't exist otherwise. Most of it was political gobbledygook, essentially preventing them from competing with each other secretively. Basically, the concept was these corporate alliances were merging into one mega monopoly to take control over all the power in the galaxy. That meant that they would form certain agreements and force trade embargoes and so forth against one another that wouldn't actually hurt them. They'd keep up the public image of economic rivals, but just increase the price for their benefit. This, however, over the past 3 or 4 years resulted in the distinct division between Plagueis and Sidious. The two Sith Lords had visions for the galaxy. Plagueis' had shifted ever since the incorporation of Kenobi and Tyrannus, much earlier than Dooku would have ever joined. Without them, he'd be more inclined to start a clone war and raise an army through the corporate powers. But now, he believed that the Jedi could be reduced to ash, and the galaxy could slip further into greed. It was simple. Instead of being so secretive with the alliances, just say the quiet part out loud. Sidious preferred to have absolute control, and because he was already working his way deep into Chancellor Valorum's camp, he felt slighted and betrayed by his dear old master. Obi-Wan, Maul, and Dooku were completely out of the picture for these disagreements and discussions. However, thanks to Sidious and Plagueis, Obi-Wan was preparing to act on a plan that would favor either scenario or plan for the Sith. Kenobi, thanks to contacts Plagueis had on Coruscant and training received from Sidious, laid a trap at the heart of the Jedi Temple. His mission was to never leave the Jedi Order until he became the last of the Jedi. Obi-Wan was given hundreds of nanobots at a time. This wasn't going to be a tiny concentrated explosion. This would be at the center of the temple. Over the span of weeks into months, as per the plan, Kenobi would lay these nanobots at different sectors of the temple, specifically around the Great Hall and the corridor into the archives. The reason for the multiple-week plan was to ensure his loyalty. Obi-Wan had become radicalized in the years following Qui-Gon's death. Not only was he being fed a lie, but the Sith gave him scenarios. An example would be the time he was on a mission to Megiddo, a system he did not know Plagueis had deep roots on. Obi-Wan would be befriended by an orphanage of kids, who were left out because of some budget cuts made by the Jedi. It was unintentional collateral damage, but the point being, the Jedi accidentally made some kids homeless by supporting something the Senate did. Sidious then employed a number of criminals to kill the children, but they were only hired to threaten them. Do anything they can to spook the Jedi, but do not harm the kids. Obi-Wan believed that the children were in danger, so he murdered the thugs in cold blood. Didn't matter if they surrendered or tried to beg for mercy, he killed all of them when the children weren't looking. It was an evil show of strength. Kenobi used the dark side, fueled his power, and controlled the Force in ways unlike he ever had before. This was his assurance that what Sidious taught him was true. Their identity as Sith remained a secret to him, but he used the dark side readily. He didn't need to know all of that. All he knew was he killed people to protect others. The dark side made him capable of resolving wounds still left behind by Qui-Gon's death. And the Jedi, they did nothing. They put these children on the street, They allowed those children to be thrown into slavery, which is what would have happened to them if he was not there. The radicalized Obi Wan had another 15 or so experiences that were pretty much similar to that. Not all of them were the exact same, that'd be preposterous, but they were thematically similar. The Jedi did something bad and people paid for it, while they remained in their tower on Coruscant completely unaffected. When Obi Wan bombed the Jedi Temple, it would make news across the galaxy. He wasn't inside the structure when it happened. He was actually on a mission with Master Windu. The two of them had grown a bit closer as allies during Obi-Wan's years as a knight. Because he was with the Master of the Order on a mission that Kenobi anticipated, thanks to Sidious intermingling in external system affairs, he was away when the bomb sounded off. Smoke filled the sky around the Jedi Temple. Emergency services from around the city were brought in, and Master Windu left Obi-Wan at the site of their mission to attend all of this. He didn't want Kenobi getting caught up in the terror. Obi-Wan would use this time to meet with Plagueis in person for the first time. The Sith Lord prided Obi-Wan on his work and showed off a new gift, a crimson lightsaber. It would become Obi-Wan's, and it was constructed by Plagueis the Wise. But before he could receive it, there was still much work to complete. A new batch of lessons were taught to Obi-Wan for the few days he remained away from the temple and the carnage. Did he ever feel regret over this mass death? Truthfully, a little. But Plagueis wiped all of that away by placing himself in between the Ru inside Obi-Wan's mind and what he was to become. The last little bit of Jedi within him vanished, and Kenobi recognized that what he had done was the right thing, the necessary thing. The Jedi needed to pay for their inaction, and so they did. Mace would bring Obi-Wan back to the temple after the official reports were out and the quote-unquote culprit was found. 2,541 Jedi were claimed in the blast, 1/4 of the entire Order gone in one moment. It was such a devastating blast that the Jedi Order was removing themselves from Coruscant to focus on protecting themselves. The only culprit they found led them to believing that they had political rivals, but even Valorum jumped into their corner to renounce this culprit. Sympathy may have been high for the Jedi publicly, but the bombing didn't immediately protect them either. The Jedi were attacked, therefore from the Senate's perspective, and from the angle of the very illustrious Senator Palpatine, the Senate was in danger. If the Jedi could be attacked as such, then what was stopping enemies of the Jedi from changing their target to the Republic? Palpatine went against Valorum's decision to give aid, and requested that the Senate reject any further affiliation with the Jedi to protect their interests. It wasn't super popular outside the Senate, but that wasn't important, because everything that did matter happened inside the Senate. The representatives of the most powerful systems in the galaxy saw the Jedi at their most vulnerable and turned their backs. It wasn't malevolent or violent, they just looked away, forcing the Jedi to deal with the effects by themselves. Inside the Sith lines, though, a conflict was beginning. Sidious was turning more and more against Plagueis' new plan. Sifo-Dyas, who was accidentally killed in the bombing, would never set up the Jedi to create the clone army. The war would never need to happen now, and Plagueis expressed that heavily. Sidious refused to let go of his plan though, and before a true division could be started, Plagueis came to a realization. Sidious' power would only make him crave more. He would never find peace with this scenario. No matter what the Sith accomplished, it would never be what he wanted unless he had total control. And so, Plagueis made a judgment call. He betrayed and murdered Sidious in his sleep. This, ironically, did not drastically change anything for the Sith, because the plan changed with Dooku's earlier involvement. The next step was for the corporate alliances to begin their rounds of blackmail. The blockade of Naboo was planned for 2 years following the bombing, and it gave the Sith ample time to surround the corporate powers with Senate leadership that supported them. This would be the work of Dooku and Plagueis. Maul would simply train under the Sith Lord, and Obi-Wan remained their eyes and ears inside the Jedi Order. When the blockade did come around 2 years later, the Sith were in a dominant position in the galaxy. They may have not had armies or navies, but they were entirely made up of wealth and political power. The thing with the corporate alliance treaty signed on Sereno was the influence it gave the mega powers. They all had their hands in people's pockets within the Senate. By unifying their interests into one big corporation, they could simply blackmail and expose anyone who challenged them into the ground. So Palpatine was a difficult loss inside the Senate, but it really didn't matter, since the powerhouses were already united before the trade lane tax was implemented by Valorum's administration. The Jedi had their own numerous problems, but they still sent 2 Jedi to help with the blockade. Even though the Senate distanced themselves from the fractured order, they didn't stop helping where people needed it. Quinlan Vos and Aayla Secura wouldn't discover any slaves from Tatooine, but they would lose their lives to Maul on Naboo. Aayla was a younger Padawan with stunted growth due to the bombing, and was dealt with earlier by Maul. Quinlan held his own for long enough, but couldn't compete with Maul in the long run. That would be another sign to the Order that they were being hunted, but Obi-Wan remained under the radar. Mace's trust in Kenobi is actually what dealt the killing blow to the Jedi Order. The Council split the Order up into 10 minor sects to make sure they survived. No longer can any individual rip through their ranks, which, yes, that is true. No singular individual would rip through their ranks. However, Plagueis, Maul, and Dooku would, with a force of battle droids following behind them, completely wipe out an entire sect of the Order, under the protection of Saesee Tiin and Plo Koon. It would be horrible. The Jedi weren't able to hold their own. The survivors were given a chance to join or die. None of them joined, so the result was the obvious. This slaughter coincided with a complete sweep in the election cycle of the year. Chancellor Valorum's term ended, and he could no longer run. Ironically, the last hope for democracy died with Valorum's last 2 terms expiring. He returned a lectury, and the business representative from the Trade Federation, Lot Dodd, won overwhelmingly as the new chancellor. Was it rigged? You be the decider of that. Yeah, it was rigged. No one could outvote the powerful corporate alliances that slowly stopped hiding their influence and their power, and just showed it off for everyone to see. What were the people going to do? They purchased from every single one of these powerhouses. If you tried to boycott one of them, you'd be buying from the other. And no one has the materials to create the objects that people wanted on a weekly basis. So what are you to do? Move away? Well, good luck with that. Most non-scam credit lines went to the banking clans, and yeah, they were a part of the corporate alliances. Good luck paying off the interest rate that could sink an intergalactic starliner company overnight. No one could do anything. And with influence slowly poking through the holes in democracy, the people recognized the end of a prosperous era. Perhaps it never really was that prosperous, but the competing factions no longer fought for market gains because they all shared it. The Jedi weren't involved because the Senate listened to Palpatine. The blockade over Naboo also told the Jedi that they could die and no one would care. And with the recent losses of Plo, Saesee, and their entire sect of Jedi, the Order moved further into secrecy. A collection of counselors, masters, and knights were thus gathered. Yoda, with Obi Wan as the last survivor in his lineage, put him into this group. Mace wasn't the reason Kenobi was involved, but every single location of the Jedi sect would be revealed. Obi Wan would memorize coordinates and send messages to the Sith, so that they could act when they desired. Kenobi remained the Jedi who saw everything, and in some terrifying fashion became the true last of the Jedi, the one who sold his soul and everything so that the Jedi Order could be consumed. In many ways, like Dooku, he became blinded by what the Jedi couldn't do, rather than what they tried to do. They were an old order that failed frequently, more than they probably should have, but their intent was never malicious. That didn't stop people from paying for their mistakes, though. Over the span of the next 17 weeks, the Jedi Order would be tracked down and defeated by a combined force of Sith and experimental droids from the corporate alliances. Plagueis' Sith Order slowly grew, with Jedi betraying the sect and joining the Sith. While Skywalker would never find himself involved in the mysticisms of the Force, cause Saboba nuked his pod racer after losing to him in the Boonta Eve Classic, the Force wouldn't also exactly descend into darkness. It would just become muddled. Something that Plagueis understood but never told Palpatine before killing him was that the Force would never benefit them if they corrupted it. The greatest lords to ever exist gripped the galaxy with an iron fist, and they all lost it eventually. Plagueis wanted eternity to himself, but not at the cost of losing it over power. So instead of a Sith Empire and the traditional approach, with warships and sieges and destruction, it was political powerhouses. Sure, revolutions happened, but the corporate alliances were directly in control over everything. Plagueis and his Sith simply mentored them. They didn't force their hand, they grew in size, and mastered alchemy in its many different forms. Obi-Wan and Maul became brother-like Sith until Sabotage and Farrell found themselves as acolytes inside the Sith Order. An assortment of fallen Jedi were given a chance to prove themselves as Sith Inquisitors. Obi-Wan was also allowed to expand the interests of the Sith. He'd be permitted to reunite with Satine, in the promise that the heir to their throne would remain loyal to the Sith way, and that was a promise he would attempt to guarantee. Dooku and Kenobi did eventually meet and grow an interesting dynamic. They didn't dislike each other, but Obi-Wan didn't have a lot of respect for Dooku. He was a shadow, someone who attempted to manipulate like Plagueis, but couldn't compare in the slightest. Obi-Wan's deep respect for Darth Plagueis the Wise is what kept him inside the Sith Order. The Force may have not been broken, but the fate of the galaxy would be forever decided no longer by the Banite Sith, but by the Plagueis lineage. And that, my friends, is a f***ed up story. Special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about it. Fun times, lots of fun times. My favorite part is when Anakin gets nuked in a pod racing accident. Anyways, the story is very dark. In a way that Acolyte kind of covers, this one is a story that's really meant to cover like the seduction of the dark side. A lot of similarities between Obi-Wan and Anakin's turn here. More of this turn though is more of like Palpatine convincing Obi-Wan that if he used the dark side, he'd actually be able to save Qui-Gon. Obviously he doesn't and he can't bring him back. But it's like that thought of like, oh, maybe I could save others from doing it. And then he kind of gets gaslit into believing that's true because of those 15 or so missions where he's just saving people by using the dark side, and those people could have been saved if it weren't for the Jedi doing something stupid. And that is a really simplified version of what it is, but that is what Obi-Wan is seeing. He's seeing how effective he is with the dark side in real time, and how ineffective the Jedi are. This one is definitely very dark, but I also wanted to go the route where like, because the Force is always going to respond to the Sith, but I wanted the Sith to kind of take up a position similar to the Night Sisters. I think Plagueis is like the one Sith who is smart enough to be like, huh, if I keep neutralizing the Force, maybe the Force won't smack me back. And then like every other Sith, they get smacked back when they do. So I feel like he'd be the one guy to be like, maybe I shouldn't do that. And he doesn't. And so their big thing is just, we're gonna run the corporate alliances to be what they are. That whole line of like, just say the quiet part out loud is basically the theme of the second half of the story, is that the corporate alliances, they have all the power, they're just saying that they have the power now. You know, Lot Dodd becomes chancellor and every politician is backed by them. So, you know, dark story, kind of realistic. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.